Public places in the South generally had very hard dividing lines. Whites over here, blacks over there. Public transportation proved to be the exception to this rule because transit companies found it impractical to provide completely separate vehicles for each race and decided to separate the races within a single vehicle instead. It costs way too much money to provide both blacks and whites with separate buses, so they had to share. Thus, trolleys, streetcars, and buses stood as the public space in which whites and blacks came into the earliest and closest contact, which many whites really did not like. To some of them, it was like a sort of recipe for violence, like it appeared to this Atlanta judge here.
If a big black man got into the streetcar and pressed up against my wife, I would brain him.
And I believe him, because there was probably a good chance of him getting away with it at that time. To prevent such contact, Georgia had passed segregation statutes for streetcars in 1890, the first such laws in the South. Under the legislation, conductors of private transit companies had almost unlimited police powers. They could order paying customers to move anywhere they chose, eject them from the trolley, and, if they deemed it necessary, resort to physical force. Now watch where the people were ordered to go.
White people will seat from front of car toward the back.
Passengers were reminded,
and colored people from rear toward front.
What subliminal message did this send? Whites were the leaders in the front, and blacks were the followers in the back. Whites were the head, and blacks were the tail. This was just another version of the status that white and black were supposed to represent. It was another part of the mental warfare that had been going on since colonial times. Let's continue. But the precise dividing line remained fluid, to be moved forward and back at the driver's discretion. For many white Atlantans, such arrangements were not enough. No matter how rigidly or ruthlessly the segregation statutes were enforced, the simple act of sharing public space with blacks was too much for them. Just the act of simply sharing the bus was too much for many whites. And you have to remember that humans don't naturally come out with this type of disdain and hatred towards other people. What we are hearing about right here is the mental product that was shaped a certain way over centuries. And it was strong. In 1920, for instance, an angry Atlantan wrote the president of Georgia Power, the company that ran the streetcar lines, to voice his neighbors' objections to the line running through their very desirable residential section off Ponce de Leon Avenue. The angry man said this:
especially during the rush hours of 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. This car is continually crowded with Negroes, and it is very displeasing to have to ride in a car filled with this aroma.
It's getting wild today, good citizens of the country. Although many whites boycotted the streetcars, large numbers continued to ride, taking comfort in the knowledge that the racial code would be strictly enforced by the conductors. What's the racial code? White at the top, or in the front in this case, and blacks at the bottom, or in the back of the bus. That's the racial code within the racial worldview. So as long as that was in effect, some whites had no problem hopping on the bus with Negroes. Under their watch, any black who challenged the rules of behavior was dealt with swiftly and harshly. How harshly? Well, one time there was a Negro man who got on the bus and the bus was crowded. And the man was dirty from doing all the work he'd been doing all day. So he didn't want to move through the crowd and get the people dirty. But the driver was super adamant about forcing him to move to the back. And when he resisted, the driver grabbed an iron tool and proceeded to go upside the man's head. The passenger, however, wrestled the tool away from him. As the rest of the car looked on in horror, he beat the driver nearly to death and then fled the scene. Oh, snaps. This stuff can get wild at any moment. Shortly afterward, all Atlanta motormen were deputized and armed with revolvers, big bangers and firecrackers instead of these little iron objects that they had before. And now you know the supremacy within the driver was about to get wild. And it did. Because there were a few instances where blacks were shot and killed for not following the racial code. And guess what? In all of these shootings, the city sided with the drivers. The game was rigged. This was Atlanta of the mid-1940s, before the rise of Bill Hartsfield's biracial coalition and before the city started to worry about the impact that racial conflicts had on its image, meaning it was all before Atlanta understood that it was losing money by behaving that way. As the Hartsfield coalition took shape, brutal acts of violence gave way to subtler suppression. At the most basic level, drivers seemed to delight in the power they had to order black riders to move back or stand at the driver's whim. In 1948, for instance, a white passenger complained of how a driver on the Marietta Street trolley had treated a black passenger in
a most humiliating and ungentlemanly manner.
Even though he was already sitting behind the color line, the passenger was ordered to move farther back. Likewise, on several lines, drivers moved the color line back during rush hours, but refused to readjust it when whites left. While most of the seats before them remained empty, blacks had to huddle in the aisle, like sheep in the winter when they try to stay warm. Some of the bus drivers were playing these types of games. And blacks probably went along with it because they knew some of these drivers were absolutely crazy. And at any time could pull out his firecracker and turn every Negro on that bus into a Vienna sausage. So they didn't have much choice but to huddle in the aisle. And it was even so bad that some of the whites even spoke up against it.
It breaks my heart to see white people act so rude. I am white and not what is known as a nigger lover, but I do like common decency.
Let's hear some more.
I have found trolley drivers consistently rude, inconsiderate, and in many cases just plain mean. They seem to despise all their customers and take a delight in passing them whenever possible, especially their Negro customers.
I grew up riding the city bus because much of the time we didn't have a car. And if you've ridden the city bus enough times, you'll know that there are some drivers that just want to take off. They can't wait to do it. Right? I've seen people running down on the bus and the bus driver knows that they're coming and would close the door and get up out of there and wouldn't think twice about it. And it didn't matter what skin color the person had. The bus driver was leaving. That's similar to what this man is talking about here on how they especially wanted to pass up Negroes. Other insults faced by blacks were actually part of the transit company's policy. While all passengers paid and entered by the front door, for instance, blacks alone were required to exit at the rear, designed to convey the same message as making them sit in the back. And you have to understand that these are subtle messages created to communicate to the unconscious mind. It's not meant to be said outright. It's meant to be absorbed by the unconscious, which then integrates these messages and influences future thinking and behavior. That's where the real power of control is at. And you can see how well the Europeans and whites understood this by examining the way they set up their system of domination. Right? It's very clear that they understood what they were doing. Now, with that being said, black leaders definitely had an issue with what the black community was dealing with and how they were being treated. And they tried to resolve the issues privately with the white leadership, as had been done previously. They met with some of the officials. They brought up the problems of making blacks exit through the back and all types of things. But ultimately, however, communication did little to solve the problems. Transportation segregation, company officials repeatedly pointed out, had been legislated by the state assembly and upheld by the courts. As a private business, they were obligated to live by these laws. The officials said that they were forced to segregate the buses because the state and the courts required it. Now pay attention because blacks are about to get strategic. Unable to negotiate a change, black leaders decided on another course of action, inspired by Atlanta's own Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor's son from Ebenezer Baptist Church and a graduate of Morehouse College. King had since moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where he famously led protests against that city's segregated bus lines in 1955 to 56. You had a man named Reverend John Porter, and from within him emerged the resistance entity. He got on the bus one day, and he decided that he was going to sit in the front of the bus. When whites got on the bus, they were shocked because the Reverend stayed in the front as if he was the white man himself. Now, obviously, the people didn't like it, and the conductor most certainly didn't like it. So he said this,
Boy, get up, move to the back, and let those folks sit down.
The minister refused to move.
Boy, I am talking to you.
And for several minutes, the good Reverend stood firmly before he finally decided to exit the bus. But it wasn't over yet. A few weeks later, Reverend Porter tested another of the segregation statutes, the rule that blacks had to leave by the back door. Now the persistence entity had emerged within him, which causes a person to keep trying even in the face of obstacles. So we have the resistance and persistence entities working together in Reverend Porter right here. Now watch this. When the bus he was riding reached the corner of Walton and Broad, Reverend Porter got up and walked to the front exit. The driver told him to leave by the back, but the minister proceeded out the front. Outraged, the driver suddenly closed the mechanical doors as Reverend Porter was halfway through them, pinning the preacher. Only through his own efforts was he able to free himself. That was a brave man. Now, there were others that were brave as well, like Reverend William Holmes Border and other ministers who started a movement to end the segregation of transportation. In keeping with the Atlanta approach to race relations, the ministers met with Mayor Hartsfield to discuss their plans in advance. All they wanted to do, they told him, was secure grounds for challenging the state's segregation statutes in court, which means that someone needed to be arrested to have a legal case. Now look at how clean they were with this. The Supreme Court in 1956 ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional in Montgomery. That's what Dr. King aided in. So the ministers in Atlanta were planning to use that court case as a means to help desegregate the buses in Atlanta. And that's why someone needed to get arrested so it could be challenged legally. Always mindful of his city's public image, Hartsfield asked if there was any way it could be done without arresting the ministers. The ministers said, heck no. Heck no, it must go down with the arrest. Confronted with the inevitability of their challenge and convinced of the likelihood of its success, Mayor Hartsfield carefully orchestrated the desegregation of his city's buses. Now, he already knew the ministers were going to win. So his main concern at that time was making sure that Atlanta looked good in the process. Right? So the ministers were to ride the bus alone and make this challenge as quiet and peaceful as possible without too much public support. In addition, while they would be breaking the rules of segregation, the ministers promised not to violate taboos of racial intimacy.
We will not sit by a white person. Under no circumstances will any of us sit by a white woman.
Because this would have caused an uproar. You remember what the man said in the beginning about what he would do, right? So don't break that rule. That's what they're saying. So on January 9th, 1957, 20 ministers hopped on the bus and sat wherever the heck they wanted to. The young driver said nothing to the ministers but refused to move the bus.
It's not going anywhere.
Someone shouted from outside, and all the white passengers filed off the bus, except one. An Atlanta Transit System manager soon arrived, telling the driver to switch the sign to special and drive the bus straight to the barn, just as Reverend Borders had predicted. Once at the barn, the ministers exited by the front door and left the scene without any ugliness. Now, after the challenge, the ministers were successfully arrested as planned. And essentially it was scripted because they had a designated place where to arrest them. The mayor even tried to offer to send a limousine, right? And when it went down, there were crowds of people who showed up to see the ministers taken away in the paddy wagon. And then afterwards, the ministers were booked and then they were bonded out within 2 hours. So it really was just going through the process. By the end of the day, everyone involved was satisfied. The ministers had secured grounds for a test case against state segregation laws and were satisfied to fight it out in the courts.
We've accomplished our objective.
Reverend Borders told his supporters,
The fight will be in the courts, and we won't attempt to ride the buses integrated again until it's settled.
that was clean work by the ministers for sure. At the same time, the mayor safeguarded the positive public image of his city.
Atlanta has an excellent record before the nation for its good race relations. We in Atlanta have felt that this was a desirable thing, not only for the sake of decency, but from the standpoint of business as well.
Oh, we know that's right, Mr. Hartsfield. After the ugliness of the Montgomery boycott, the nation marveled at how smoothly, almost effortlessly, Atlanta had desegregated its buses. Once the court case had been won, segregationists again urged whites to abandon the buses. Uh-oh, here it comes. These leaders' revulsion resonated deeply with their fellow whites.
There's nothing more intimate and integrated
One Atlantan wrote disgustedly in 1959,
than a black sitting beside a white girl on the trolley.
a Northern man warned Chief Jenkins about what would happen to Atlanta's desegregated buses as whites fled in fear.
As of today, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland public transportation systems are mere shells of their former place in public utility. They are almost abandoned to the private car, bumper to bumper, one man to a vehicle, definitely to avoid integration.
That's part of creating that distance that we've spoken about before. And all of this is what contributed to the rise of suburban living and private car ownership. Census reports from 1960 demonstrate that, as some had predicted, whites had indeed fled the system and taken to private cars in large numbers. In several neighborhoods, working-class whites now use private cars to get to their jobs instead of public transportation, by a 2-to-1 margin. And over the next decade, as desegregation picked up speed, so too did white flight from the lines. We've got more on the way, so stay tuned. Because bus transportation wasn't the only piece of the public that Negroes were trying to break up. They had other pieces that they had their mind on as well, which we'll talk about in the next commentary. All right? And so I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael. And I'll see you in the free world.